Okay, it's 4 o'clock. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar organised by the Royal Town Planning Institute's Young Planners in the East of England. Today's webinar is on employment-led growth in a post-COVID world, lessons from the Cambridge sub-region, with Cambridge Ahead and Cambridge University's Cities and Transport Group. So my name is John Mason, and I'm on this year's East of England Young Planners Committee, and I'll be chairing the webinar today. I'm a senior planner with Carter Jonas, based at our Cambridge Central office at 1 Station Square. Our Cambridge office is one of the largest teams of planning consultants and development surveyors in the Eastern region, as well as surveyors in our rural, commercial and residential divisions. So our two speakers today are Matthew Bullock and Dr. Ying. Matthew Bullock is a founder and honorary vice chair of Cambridge Ahead and chair of its regional economic planning group. Matthew's background is in banking and finance, and he has spent time with Barclays, TOP Biosystems, and the Norwich and Peterborough Building Society. More recently, Matthew's been on the advisory board of the Judge Business School, a member of the university's audit committee, the non-executive director of Cambridge University's Hospitals Foundation Trust, chairman of the advisory board for the ESRC Centre for Business Research, chairman of the International House Trust Limited, and master of St Edmund's College, Cambridge. Dr. Ying is a lecturer at the University of Cambridge's Department of Architecture and a director of the Martin Centre for Architectural and Urban Studies. At the Department of Architecture, Ying specialises on city planning, urban design and urban modelling, and leads the Cities and Transport Research Group. Among a wide range of research interests, Ying leads the city-scale data science and urban modelling applications at the EPSRC Centre for Smart Infrastructure and Construction. He is the principal investigator for a research project to assess alternative growth scenarios for the Combined Authority of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, funded by the Combined Authority and Cambridge Ahead, and this talk will be exploring aspects of that work. So just before we get underway, I have a couple of housekeeping points to help you make the most out of this session. As attendees, you have all been muted by the organiser. If you have a question for the organiser or speakers, then please send your question via the question box in the GoToWebinar panel, which may be on the right or the top of your screen. The speakers' presentations will run for approximately 40 minutes with questions at the end. I will pick a few questions from those submitted to be answered at the time, and any questions which we don't have time for will be considered after the session and answers emailed to all participants. This webinar will be recorded and available on the RTPI YouTube channel after the event. If you personally lose connection to the session, then please try rejoining via the link emailed to you from GoToWebinar. You may want to ensure your Wi-Fi is at the optimum level by disconnecting all other devices from your Wi-Fi. So that's it from me. Now it's over to Matthew and Ying.
Thank you very much. This is a very disembodied experience. I can see my screen, and I understand you can see my face, but I can't see any of you. So I'm going to talk to my screen. And the program that we're going to run through is, first of all, I'm going to talk about the regional economies in general, the actors and their interactions. Then I'm going to pass across to Ying to talk about regional spatial systems. And both of these talks, parts of the talk, are really about the theory. And then I'll come down to some of the regional planning and regional economic data that we've assembled. And then Ying and I, but predominantly Ying, will talk about the spatial vision for Cambridge, which we developed out of that modelling. And then at the end, Ying will talk a bit about some of the work we've done, which was looking at the impacts of COVID on people's patterns of work and possibly on transport. So that's the agenda for today. So let me start off by talking about regional economies. Many of you are in regional offices, and that's analogous, I suppose, in the surveying business to what I was as a bank manager. You look at your local area and you say, okay, what kind of players do I have in that area? And some players are worthwhile talking to because they're actors and have their own decision making, but there are many players who don't. And it's worthwhile trying to come at this in a way by trying to understand what interleaved layers of actors we have in a regional economy. So who are the participants? What are their linkages? What are the issues to do with locational factors? Why are they there? And that's for a little bit of agglomeration, and about the idea of functional economies and market towns. And out of this, I think you'll start to see that I'm not a believer in corridors, I am a believer in spatial centres, but let me get you there. So first of all, when you go down any sort of business park, you'll find there are a series of local firms. There are about 100,000 of these with below 10 employees in the Eastern region. And these are usually small businesses, privately owned, and they're there because that's where they happen to do what they do. And their markets are really quite limited. They tend to service the local people, local town. And these businesses are not particularly replicable. They are the businesses of those individuals. Many of them are service businesses and are often quite lowish value added. And many of them are lifestyle businesses. They don't make a huge amount of money, but they pay for a living for the person who owns them. You might find some larger ones. There are about 20,000 which have up to 250 employees in the whole of the Eastern region. I'm not just talking about Cambridge here. And some of these are part of the national economy, and they're there for no particular reason. That they just, that is where they happenstance to be. Occasionally you'll get a star, and if I had to sort of say a star that comes out of this kind of firm, I mean, Adnams is a brewer, was started by 4 farming families in Southwold. Ridgeons would be another kind of local business that had grown up simply serving the local community, just got bigger and bigger, has now been bought by a Welsh company, but essentially was a regional business and was serving the local economy. And occasionally you'll get companies that go on to becoming national level companies. So Green King, for example, Geest or Norwich Union are companies which have got to be sort of PLCs and grew up, but with no particular reason for being where they were other than that that's where they started. The next level of companies that you'll find are national company units. And these things, there are sort of 60 PLCs in the Eastern region. Most of the units, though, are actually functional units of national groups. Some of their sales offices or shops or service offices. And we just don't know. I've never counted in the whole of the Eastern region. I could probably hazard a guess in the Cambridge area. These are just simply offices that are set up there. And the reason they're there is that they are maybe large production units, such as Johnson Matthey at Royston. And they would have, if they were production units, big impacts on the local economy in terms of the labour force and the space and the infrastructure they take. But a great many of them are kind of just part of a national network that's been created. And they have very little local intelligence. They are basically tactical responses to national marketing strategies, and they have quite limited local sourcing. But they're there. If you go down any high street, these are the multiples, if you like, that you see in the high street. They are reflective. The reason they're there is reflective of regional factors and things like the local market they're serving, or they may be very much driven by cost factors. And essentially these units survive if they're making money for the parent. If they don't, then they'll be closed. There isn't much kind of loyalty to the area. They're just there because the market they serve or the production factors that they're using are located in the region. We then have a few multinationals, and there are about, these are very similar to the national units in the way they behave. They're part of some international marketing or production, very little local intelligence. If, for example, you've ever tried to deal with Coca-Cola's service operation in Peterborough or Mars Foods when they were there, there's nobody who takes the decisions, the kind of basic operational staff, but no, the decisions about these units are made very much somewhere way away. They're reflective of local factors, labour and space, maybe some infrastructure of transport. They're very grant sensitive, and there are about 1,400 of these plants scattered across the Eastern region, most of them actually related to the motorways. They can have very big impacts. I mean, someone like Ford at Brentwood or GM at Luton or GSK at Stevenage are very, very big entities. But again, their roles are essentially cost and return driven. And again, these people are eventually mobile, as we found in, for example, like Peterborough. a number of Mars came in for a period and then left because it wasn't making enough money. There again, they're not deeply rooted, they just happen to use the local facilities. The fourth group, which is the really ones that we're most interested in, are these regional cluster firms. Now, these are usually businesses which start within a region and are managed and owned within the region. And they typically produce goods or services of a specialist nature. And there are about 8,000 of these in the Eastern region, with about 5,000 of them in the Cambridge area, which has been a particularly rich generator of this kind of company. They operate and initially sell within the region, usually to other companies in the same or adjacent sectors, but they're very quick, we noticed, to internationalize their sales. Again, they're typically in B2B industrial sectors. They don't typically sell to consumers, but their consumer customers are typically national or multinational companies. They are selling specialist services into these businesses. Interestingly, and I'll come and show you some pictures of this later on, they tend to co-locate around usually a source of supply, but sometimes of demand. And examples, if you like, I mean, this is a very old idea. This is not a new phenomenon. Marshall wrote about it in the 19th century, but somewhere like Yorkshire had a big wool business, and it was there because they had a supply of soft water and coal for making the looms and the spinning jennies work. Hull has an interesting cluster of static caravans. It's the leading static caravan producer in Europe, and it's there because they originally was the ship repair business. We talked about oil and gas in Yarmouth because that was meeting the demand for the North Sea rigs, and in Cambridge because of the supply of university research, and we'll come on to Cambridge in particular a little later on. So these are a quite specific group of firms, and they behave in a different kind of way from the other three that I've talked about, the three groups of firms. And they interact in different ways. So, for example, the national companies and the multinational companies do very little sourcing from local firms, very little interaction. They're just there. The regional cluster firms actually tend to be much more generative of interaction. So, for example, as a bank, when I was working in Barclays in Cambridge, we noticed that the printers and the taxi firms and so forth were all thriving as a result of having business from the local regional firms. And they can have effects, obviously, on competition for labour and land, and they can create congestion if they grow too close together. The relationship of these firms, regional cluster firms, is quite interesting with the national and multinationals. As I've said, they typically sell to companies in this area. And what has tended to happen in the Cambridge area is that these companies have then been acquired by multinationals. That brings in money and management, but it kind of can lead to the company being bought and then being taken away because the behavior of the multinationals may be to remove it. In the 1970s, there were a whole series of CAD companies that were bought by Americans and taken away. More recently, that pattern has changed, and we're starting to find that the multinationals are coming and staying because of the interesting ecosystem we have here. So the interaction of these things needs to be understood. The local firms, I think, get very romanticized. You'll often hear Conservative politicians talking about, oh, we must take care of the acorns because they'll grow to oaks. But actually, it's pretty rare. Most of those businesses have fairly kind of humdrum lives. There was some research done originally by an American economist called Birch, which suggested they were terribly good at creating employment, but also what he did in the study was they're also fairly good at losing employment, and the jobs they provide are not terribly secure. The majority of small and medium-sized firms either serve local markets or engage in B2B business. Some of it gets into the national and multinational businesses. Majority don't. And the relationship of these local firms and regional cluster firms to national and multinational companies has not been fully mapped. But I think that what we're seeing is that globalization has created long and sophisticated supply chains for these big companies, and they then draw in smaller suppliers. That can be very brutal. Anybody who's seen how the farmers have been dealt with by the supermarkets can see if you're a low value participant, it can be really rough. If you're a higher value participant, you can actually grow quite successfully. And ARM is an example of a company, Cambridge, which grew by basically supplying very high value components to multinationals and captured new markets as a result of that. The clusters, which are kind of where the regional firms that we're sort of, these 8,000 that I talked about, particularly interesting, are kind of really organic systems. They breed local specialisms. They result from companies competing with each other. They create specializations. They more typically are a supply response. But you get also collaboration and competition between the participants driving forward technical advances. And from that, you get progressive fragmentation to specialisms. And this builds a bigger supply base and it makes it worthwhile having training and other ancillary support services. They work partly because they are risk management systems for the participants. They spread the risk and therefore are quite resilient. It certainly has encouraged the inflow of specialist staff. Cambridge has grown particularly from people migrating to Cambridge from the rest of the UK. And it helps you to build managerial experience about growing companies. And one's able to then start to build up people like what I call the peri-polloi, as the lawyers, the accountants, the finance people, property specialists like yourselves, technical authors and PR people who help these companies to grow. And this then breeds high rates of capital formation and investment. So what these companies, if you have an economy, a regional economy, which has a lot of these regional firms in clusters in it, you end up with a different kind of economy than an economy which is very much based upon the national companies and local companies. So for example, Peterborough as an economy, which I know pretty well, is made up predominantly of national and multinational companies with some local companies, and its original engineering cluster has pretty much frayed away, leaving really only a couple of companies in that area. And the relationship between the Cambridge economy, for example, and the Peterborough economy is very weak. There's very little interaction. They're very different economies. But they are kind of centres, and they are, particularly in the Cambridge case, the scale of the Cambridge economy has grown outwards and is really a functional economy which kind of works organically as a result of having this highly active sector within it. Now, let me pass over to Ying to talk about regional economies as spatial systems. Ying.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So I'll follow on to summarize some of the work we have done for modeling. And the organizer said, can you describe your modeling work within a few slides of this work? And as everybody knows, that urban modeling is a highly complex thing, and we find it complex too. And lots of the planners in audience may have had a very bad experience of various kinds of modeling, because generally it's very data hungry, and also it gobbles up money of your budget in assessments and so on. And of course, in the university, we have had a tradition of developing new types of models, which then permeates through to businesses for their use, and also now leveraging the new data sources we have. We're also looking to always create new types of a more convenient modeling that can provide more immediate help to the practical questions. And one particular leverage we have in collaboration with Cambridge Head colleagues, Matthew in particular, was to look at all this really valuable business intelligence and the understanding of actually how businesses behave and how people behave, and then to look at the more cumulative effects of those different kinds of behaviors interacting together. And in doing so, we have created this model for a fairly large area, which is to do with Cambridgeshire and Peterborough on the whole. And Matthew, if you can bring all the graphics into this one so that we could just look at it all together. And basically, we have well, basically a model is a black box, and the new models we're doing is a silver box. Basically, you need to trust what is inside, and then you look at the inputs on the one side and outputs on the other side, right? In the input side, what you have is for different years, you input into the allocation of land for business floor space, for housing, changes to the transport, and changes to the economy, and so on. And then you put into the box first for the observed data so that the model can understand how people behave. And then it's look at actually how accurate the model can reproduce what we have observed, in this case from 2001 to 2011, and then push on forward to the years that the model doesn't know about, and then look at it again. For example, 2016, we had the data at the time of this project, and now we have updated this model to 2019. And in terms of the outputs, we look at where people live and work, given all these conditions. On the left is input, and how to travel for this kind of work and services, and how that will lead to the demand for floor space and housing, and how that the supply constraints will generate prices, and how that will affect quality of life and so on. And there are very well, theoretical papers, and for people, various level of papers that you can read. If you like to know more about that, I'll be happy to provide more reading for you. In fact, we're also running a series of conversations on urban modeling from October, so watch our website, and also I'll give John and the organizer of this talk that link so that people can get onto it. When it will be launched on the 15th of October, and it will last for 8 weeks. Now, Matthew, maybe next slide, if you could help me. One key feature I want to say about this model is that in the middle, there's a pink area, which is basically Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. This area is modeled in detail. And also the peripheral areas, which is roughly the local LEP, the local enterprise partnership area, was also modeled in detail. And successively, these details becomes less because the impact of what is happening in wider country will be having less impact in this region. And in doing so, what the model can do is to give you results without you first define the boundary. So if you like the result for Cambridge City, you can give that. Or if you like to have Greater Cambridge, that's fine. And also if you want to have for the combined authority, that's okay too. And it's basically done at the MSLA level, and for those people who understand these census units. And for traffic modeling in Cambridge, we have now upgraded to do it in more detailed levels. Matthew, next slide. And in terms of how we model the impacts, the models are not really crystal balls to tell you exactly what's going to happen and what is the GDP growth rate next year, or what is the job growth rate next year. What we could do is both to look at the level of growth in terms of higher growth and lower growth, and whatever the local authorities and the local communities want to test, right? Then also to look at the configurations of this growth. And here on the top, this is an existing city with the green dots representing the existing neighborhoods. The blue dots in the graphs, the 4 graphs on the bottom, are the possible ways to insert or add new development into the area. And all the planning colleagues will be familiar with these types of densification, particularly around railway stations. And dispersal, which is to build away from the existing city in market towns and villages. Fringe growth is to build around a city like Cambridge, right? Urban extensions in some ways. And also the building around transport corridors and the leading out from a major city. And of course, the kind of growth we're envisaging, we could now look at in this way. And then these results then inform the discussions, for example, in the CPIEI review and so on. Matthew, so I think perhaps this is the point to hand over to you, right?
Yeah. So the model that Ying has been talking about has one very important kind of major, has 2 inputs. It has the historical inputs of how people reveal their preferences about where they will want to live, where they've decided where they want to work, and the kind of trade-offs that they make to balance the economics of work and the incomes they have against the costs of where they want to live. But importantly, this is dealing with planning as employment-led. In other words, what we've observed in Cambridge's case is the pattern of settlement in Cambridge has essentially been driven by what employment has been laid down, and then people reorienting their housing to where that employment is, rather than employment finding its level where people have their housing. So what we've done then is to say, well, what is the forecast rate of growth that we should be embodying in this model? Now, we have developed the other part of this sort of set of us is the Centre for Business Research in Cambridge, a man called Dr. Andy Kosh, who has worked with us to develop some extremely detailed employment data in the Cambridge area. And this is very specific, it's public, it's based upon companies' house data, and it actually is, you can say, if you see some growth, you can actually identify what company is causing that growth. And it enables us to kind of create scenarios of the sort that Ying's talking about, which enable us to talk about how the city might grow. Let me just explain how we do this. This is not proprietary, it's proprietary data from the university, but in a sense it's open source. You can see it on the Cambridge Ahead website. Go back to my kind of idea of the different players in the region. The regional-based companies are essentially the Cambridge-based companies. You can see there the top group, where I've taken a knowledge-intensive company, Aviva, which is the old CAD centre, or Regions, as I described earlier on, at the time was independent. Those are Cambridge-based companies. We have other players of people like the non-corporate sector, the university, obviously knowledge-intensive, or the arts theatre, which is cultural rather than knowledge-intensive. Then we have the multinationals and the national companies, which we call Cambridge active companies. They have offices here, but they don't have their headquarters here. And then we have the public sector, things like the hospitals and the police. And then as a group, which is very hard to track, well, partners and sole traders, which typically are about 15% of total employment. And we draw data on these entities from public accounts that they put into Companies House, or public reports that they make available of one sort or another. And this enables us to produce very detailed data. I'm just going to show you the data for the last 3 years, up to 2019, where you can see on the left-hand side, this is the actual static data. We have 5,128 knowledge-intensive companies and who fits in which is all available on the website. They employ 69,000 people, so they're a large chunk of the employment in the area by Cambridge-based companies is knowledge-intensive, and we have a total employment from these companies in the area of 257,000. This is the Cambridge Head area, which is 20 miles as the crow flies from Great St Mary's. As you can see, we have about 20% of the companies and nearly 30% or 26%, 27% of the employment is knowledge intensive. And you can go back year by year. We also show there the turnover. And then we look at growth rates, because this is particularly relevant. So you can see 1 year and 6 year changes there. And these are very surprisingly high growth rates. And if I take the 6 year change, because that's a particularly striking thing, this is over 6 years we've tracked it. Well, we've actually tracked it for longer now, but this is 6 years data. You can see there that employment in those knowledge intensive businesses and actually across the whole of the economy, Cambridge-based companies, is 6.8% per annum growth in employment. Turnover about 9.5%, of which the higher figures are obviously in knowledge intensive. And in the last year, you can see there we had 8% growth in employment in that year, 17, 18 to 18, 19, and 5.6 overall. And these are very high numbers. It enables us to, for example, analyze business parks. So here's a range of business parks in the Cambridge area, and we have proportions of knowledge intensity, how long the companies have been there, the number of employees, very, very detailed spatial data. And I'm going to show you now agglomeration. So just watch the dots on this slide. This is the only visual capturing of agglomeration I've ever seen. This is showing where the life sciences business is located in Cambridge in 2010 to 11 to 2018. And every dot represents a company or a research institute, and the size of the dot represents the number of employees. I'm going to flick through this. I'm going to go through it once, but just watch the dots. And what you can now see is how these companies, these are new companies being formed, are locating in different places. That gives you, that is agglomeration before your very eyes. But what you can see is it clearly is in certain places that it's taking place. It is not taking place to the west. It is taking place to the south of the city and down towards the Wellcome Sanger Institute and out towards the east with Baberham and Granta Park. So pretty kind of vivid illustration of kind of power of this data. What that then enabled us to do is to say, okay, well, we now know where the companies are going to. We know which companies there are. We know how fast they're growing. How would we arrange this? Go back to Ying's models for Cambridge. And in the SPEAR work that we did, Dame Kate Barker, who chaired it, ended up making a recommendation, which was that the Cambridge should grow with a series of key densified sites, particularly on the edges of new developments being brought forward, that we should use the transport corridors to extend the clusters that we were seeing outwards, particularly towards the east, and that we should develop some ideas for green infrastructure. And we've also more recently been starting to think about the effects of the Ox-Cam arc in the northwest. But there you can see the 5 densified sites that were chosen. That's to say, CB1 around the station at the very center where John sits in his office, the biomedical campus down to the south, the science park and the Cambridge North and Northeast development around Cambridge North Station, the university's quarter out onto the west with Cambridge, West Cambridge and Eddington, and then Marshall's and Cambridge East in the east. And those are the 5 key densified sites. And then we also said that we would use the transport corridors to stretch the potential growth of the city outwards. And so you can see there are 2 particularly important arcs. One is the arc around Baberham and 6 Mile Bottom and the Genome Campus and the Chesterfords, which is very much sort of a life sciences arc. And then you can see further out in the northwest, the beginnings of the Ox-Cam arc, which is more technical and more engineering and related to the West Cambridge science sites. The third element that we came up with was this idea of a green network, and this is a picture of the Cambridge Nature Network, which we're just developing now, which you can see quite extraordinarily, well, fits like a glove around the development sites we're talking about, but gives us clear space for a green series of parks around the city for the future, City Act 2051.
Yeah, both. We've got about 5 minutes.
Yep. Ying, do you want to talk about COVID and the impacts on modelling?
Yeah, I just briefly talk about this one. Essentially, these questions that you see on the screen about densification, about office space, and whether there will be yet more morning peak rush hour traffic or not, and also the broader growth impacts. These are really uncertain questions. So Matthew, next slide. And basically what we have gone for is always the approach we've taken, is to see what evidence we have. And in this particular case, recently we have collaborated with Cambridge Ahead and also a university in Beijing called Tsinghua University to look at some of these issues and to see what lessons we could have from the previous coronaviruses like SARS and MERS, right? And we looked at a range of city regions in mainland China, in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Singapore, and South Korea, because they are very affected by SARS or MERS, or sometimes both. The lessons, the 4 lessons we have done here. The first one is that we really need to look at SMEs because they are hard hit, right? Hardest hit. And the second is really to say that the city will only recover when the epidemic is absolutely under control. Halfway opening is very difficult, and Beijing did have one episode of that and completely failed for SARS. And this third thing is to do the necessity to relaunch the city business offers, including actually what you do as planners yourselves, because you need to make clear to the people you serve that what now you are doing after this reset, right? And finally is that the law of minimal effort always applies, and residents have very short memory. They always want to go back to what they're used to. And then it's for you as planners and also for government in general to set up good legacies to ensure that next time there's protection. Next one. Yeah, so here, of course, this graph of the pink curves, which are to do with the fuel prices in the world, right? And also the blue curve, which is the World Trade Index, about how much trade is fluctuating. You could see that the previous ones were too short actually to make a dent on these broad worldwide trends, except the last one, which is to the very right, which is this current one we're doing. But here, if you look at the world trade patterns broadly, you can see that a quite perfect V shape is emerging. And this has one particular important implication for Cambridge, which is that regions like Cambridge, which people find attractive to invest and to work in, may recover sooner, and therefore the development pressures may be stronger. Next slide, Matthew. And of course, for the wider country, the recovery is not as easy. And what we are looking at with another piece of work that we've been doing from university with the UK 2070 Commission, this is currently going, this is actually new reports coming out, is really to look at both the low scenario, which is very low growth, like what Japan has achieved in the last 20 years, and the high growth, which is what Cambridge has achieved. So this is the black dotted line on top, and also a more dynamic process of recovery, which is the green line. I think this may also apply to Cambridge. Perhaps Cambridge will recover sooner, but we will need to see that. Next slide. Yeah, Matthew.
Right. You say we've got masses of data and numbers, and it's just worthwhile coming back to think about. I haven't got any people in this slide, and I've got a beheaded cow, but it's just the point we're making is that this is actually about a real place and about real people, and not just a whole series of data points.
And also a really unique city when you have a cows grazing in the middle of the city. So not very many cities in the world actually have got that.
Indeed.
Not even Oxford.
No.
Thank you both very much for that presentation, which is very interesting and I think has given us a lot to think about. So do make sure that to the audience members that you type in your questions. So I think I will start off. You mentioned earlier on in the presentation, Ying, perhaps to the dismay of some people watching, that setting up these sorts of models takes an incredible amount of time and resources. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the sources of this data and how the funding for it works, and whether, because of the very strong economy of Cambridge and the fact that we have a world-leading university here, is this something that other regions could really look at all that easily?
Increasingly easily for several reasons. The first one is that the ONS is making a lot more detailed statistics available. Some of these are still not very accurate, as Matthew will attest. But it's getting better. Secondly, the attitude towards models are now becoming much more open. And I think if one thing people have learned actually in the last few months of lockdown about science is about modeling. And now when people talk about modeling, it's less about the fashion, right, in this kind of context, but actually about serious data science work. Now, two particular things that we have benefited from this was to look at the temperature of two big markets. One is housing market through rents and house prices. This data is now becoming more and more available, including colleagues in Dr. Andy Koch's team who are really experts in doing that. So we collect a lot of data to show how those evolve, because this actually gives the signal of supply and demand in the market of land use, right? This includes housing and business floor space. And the other one, which is really interesting, the traffic flow speeds, which is basically a way how the transport demand and supply are balancing each other over time. So these two particularly helped us actually to progress with these models. And the models are now getting cheaper. And also we are putting out the new structures actually for other people to look at as well. And hopefully they'll follow.
To give you an idea of cost, the actual SPEAR report, which included the production of the report, so it was all the writing, and was about £500,000. So that was very expensive. The data that we produce, the company data, requires obviously a setup year. We would suggest people do it for 2 years. Once we do it, once we oversee them doing it, and then actually people can continue to do it. And the cost you're talking about is kind of first year is probably about 120,000, and thereafter it costs you something in the region of 30 to 40,000 a year to run the data on an annual renewal basis.
Yes. And Ying, how many people do you have working on this with you in terms of manpower?
Well, in our group currently we have 5 research fellows and 14 PhD students. Well, for this particular project, we had 2 research fellows and 2 students working on that with me for a year. Then once, as Matthew says, once it's developed, then to update it is much easier. So it's useful to set up the space when you can and through whatever funding. And then this will actually become an asset. And we have a tradition in doing it. My mentor, who taught me about modeling, Professor Marcel Echnik, who collaborated with Professor Peter Karolin to do Cambridge Futures work about 20 years ago. And since then, that model that they created was given to the Cambridge County Council for further development. And our intention is that once we have done this, we also will hand over this to local authorities if they find useful.
That's the point just to make there, is that we run these models through annually, because it's very important that you don't just simply do a one shot and then say that's it. You go back and check how it is actually happening on the ground. This is the kind of interaction with reality and modeling which is growing up.
Yes, yes, yes. In terms of the particular political context of Cambridgeshire, it's perhaps different to some other regions in that we have a number of local authorities, a county council, the combined authority and the local enterprise partnership, as well as 7 different political constituencies. So obviously Cambridge Ahead is partly funded by the combined authority, which has the input of all...
No, absolutely. Cambridge Ahead is entirely funded by its members, who are academic and business organisations. There's no government funding.
Yep. So then, how does
although SPEAR has some funding, right? So
yes,
just to
SPEAR report is jointly funded, but Cambridge Ahead is not funded by.
Yes. In terms of feeding back your findings and recommendations, how easy do you find it with all these different political levels and different political parties?
Not easy, and I think our general view is that the overlapping responsibilities make for difficult decision making. However, I think when we produced this data, I and Ying did a series of quite regular roadshows, using the data initially to explain how we got to the kind of inflamed situation we were in. And I think when we started to explain to people why it was they were seeing such high house prices and such congestion in the morning, because of the way in which the planning had underestimated the rates of growth here, and had led to people having to live further and further out and then having to tidally commute in, they then said, no, I get it. And it was quite interesting that the response was then, okay, now we understand what's actually happening spatially, what do we do to manage it? So I think it is possible to build consensus, but it does take a bit of time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So in terms of the emerging Oxford to Cambridge corridor, Matthew, I think you said earlier that you believe in spatial centres rather than corridors as such, in terms of kind of generating these regional clusters. Is the Oxford to Cambridge arc a kind of figment of government's imagination? And because is it based on a kind of economic reality, or is it a case of if we build the transport infrastructure, then it will happen?
I think my view is that there are certainly 2 clusters. There's one at Cambridge and one at Oxford. And there's potentially another one around Milton Keynes and Cranfield. So I see it as 3 clusters that happen to be in an arc. But there isn't evidence yet of the actual economic interaction between Oxford and Cambridge is very small. And the interaction between Oxford or Cambridge and Milton Keynes is very small. So I think one has to say there are 3 what I call functional economies on that arc, which can be brought closer together by transport. But I think the reason why I'm so strong on this is because I think we waste a great deal of time trying to sort of build corridors. And actually, if you want to get better growth, we concentrated on sorting out the problems of the main centres, you would get much more bangs for your buck than you would by building railways between them. So I think one of the things that we've successfully done in Cambridge is articulated quite clearly what our infrastructure priorities are for us as a functional centre. And I think the same should be done for Oxford and for Milton Keynes. And when you've done that, you can say, fine, well, how, in doing that, how do you draw those three together? But I wouldn't start from the position of saying, what I'm going to do is build a railway, and then I hope I can get lots of housing on it, and that's going to make the Cambridge economy grow. If you only do that, you exacerbate the problems in Cambridge by having more and more people piling in and not enough space for them to work in. So the sequencing of this is really quite important, and think centres, not corridors.
Yes.
And I support that. Basically, for a corridor to work, then each of these nodes needs to work, and it needs to be thought very carefully. And because as people get more wealthy and the supply chains get lengthened, then you naturally will be talking to the people you interact with anyway. So this discussion could actually come into play. And purely just develop transport infrastructure without this local level of coordinated planning of land use and built form is going to be misguided. So make sure that always that the local planning actually have fully accounted for that. Well, you need the local community's consent to develop anyway. So this is very clear.
I mean, I think, may I just say that we have actually offered once or twice that we would be very happy to do this, to use this technique to do a spatial vision for the arc. What we are in fact seeing, we just very recently completed a study looking at the northwest quadrant of Cambridge, which has been really very blighted by the A14 being so blocked, and there was no other road than the A14. And since the autumn, obviously that has opened, and we've had the A1307, getting alive again, going up towards Huntingdon, where it splits off. That used to be a kind of quite an important route for Cambridge, and then became completely blocked. Mm. What we're starting to see there is we did it because we would say, is the Oxcam arc starting to have an impact on that side? And the answer is that the arc isn't, but what is clear is that the availability of land and reasonable transport is seeing some of the Cambridge companies pushing out along that transport corridor as well. That the beginnings of a kind of budding from Cambridge is starting to take place, but there isn't much sign of kind of further western development yet, which is somehow pulling it. It's actually being pushed out from Cambridge rather than being pulled by the arc.
Hmm. Okay, well, we have
will happen in time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, the further development of Cambourne, obviously some different strategies have been put forward for how the link between Cambourne and Cambridge could be slightly faster and more efficient. Okay, so we've added.
What's very interesting actually, when we looked at the data on Cambourne, because Cambourne Business Park is now filling up. And the question is, what's it filled up with? Is it filling up with kind of knowledge-intensive businesses which are spilling out from Cambridge? And it's what we're seeing. It is full, and it's basically full up now. But it's a pattern which we've seen in places like Haverhill and Newmarket and Ely, which is that as the Cambridge economy gets more expensive, the lower value-added businesses, your local businesses in my kind of first tier of line, are being pushed outwards. They service, they're part of the Cambridge economy. So the footprint, the economic footprint of Cambridge has gone wider. It hasn't reaching out into the region, but its kind of first layer outwards is actually lower value businesses, which are sort of moving out because of the cost, but continue to want to service the Cambridge economy. So the actual knowledge intensity of the Cambourne Science Park, Cambourne Business Park, is very slight.
And this is not ideal because I think for everywhere that is currently seeking to get new job opportunities, they should think how they may directly get higher quality jobs, and which will help to create new centers, and then perhaps also connect them with efficient public transport in a dense corridor, so that the public transport itself will work as well.
On that note, we've had a question from a planning policy officer in Uttlesford, Joanna Hill. So she's asked about what could employment-led growth model, how could that help think about the vision for Uttlesford and the employment growth there?
Well, we have done some work there. I live in Chesterford, so I'm kind of so Uttlesford is quite an interesting, if you look at it detail in spatial terms. It has two economies really. It has one economy which is in Takeley and around Stansted, which is very much an east-west economy. It goes into Hertfordshire and further east in towards Braintree, and that's around the airport. It's not a particularly high-value economy, but it's certainly been growing because of the growth until COVID of the airport. The other economy is really the northern part of Uttlesford, which relates to Cambridge. So Little Chesterford Science Park is now one of the major beneficiaries of spill out from Babraham and Granta Park. And the rate of growth of life sciences businesses in that area is noticeable. And that is making the traffic that flows into Cambridge or into East Cambridge much more marked. So I think that that's the way I would tend to think of that economy. And I think the orientation of towns like Saffron Walden is going to change from being something which is much more oriented towards London and sort of city commuters to being something much more diverse. It has obviously that element growing, but it also is now drawn into the orbit of Cambridge, and the number of people who are working, for example, in Addenbrooke's or in the biomedical campus in AstraZeneca in Granta Park is quite evidently growing in Saffron Walden, and that's a very attractive opportunity. And I think it's something which I've certainly talked to Joanna too, John Lodge and Richard Pavitt and Neil Gregory about this changing face, this changing orientation of Uttlesford, and actually the potential for rising rate base, because you're getting quite high value businesses coming in a town which frankly major employer for a long time was a crane manufacturer called Acro, which went through all sorts of kind of problems. So it's changing the economic base of Uttlesford in quite an attractive way.
We've had, I think this is probably the last question that we have time for, but we've also had a question about the role of market towns. Obviously, that's something that the CPIER report looked at, and you also mentioned about places like Ely and Huntingdon becoming stronger centres for less knowledge-intense industries, but particularly market towns in light of the COVID response and the climate change agenda, and maybe thinking about the impact of home working perhaps. So where do you see that going in terms of the future modelling and future economic thinking?
Well, if I take Ely, I think Ely is actually, if once we dual the A10, which is, I think, a really important factor, Ely, I think, looks very well set. I think that it isn't only benefiting from low value business coming out. There is actually evidence of some of the high value businesses looking to that, as I think they will look to Huntingdon also when they kind of explored that road properly. So I actually think that one of the features we see of Cambridge is Cambridge pushing out along these transport corridors. That's why the transport corridor is important. And the places like Ely, which sit on very good transport links in rail terms, if they can match that in road terms, I think will grow quite strongly and will be part of, just as I think Huntingdon with the guided bus and with the 1307 now reopened, and the A1, the A14 swinging up the south of it, will start to grow and come into the Cambridge, like Saffron Walden. all these market towns are being drawn into the orbit of higher value businesses. The businesses are reaching out because the costs in Cambridge are, I mean, Little Chesterford Science Park, and there is a business park on the south side of Ely, were clearly recipients of people who found being on the Cambridge Science Park or the Innovation Centre in North Cambridge, just too expensive, or being in Granta Park was too expensive. So they graduate out to these places, and these places are getting momentum. So I'm really quite optimistic that although the first large-scale evidence you see is these kind of lower value businesses moving there, actually they're being followed by by higher value businesses. So, for example, we noticed that Cambridge Medical Robotics, which is kind of very fast-growing company, CMR, has actually moved out on the A1307 because it was, good value to go out there. They could have more space to grow, and there was obviously labour in that area which they could use, which had some technical sort of mechatronic capabilities. So I think that we will see Cambridge grow out along these transport corridors to the market towns. It is important the market towns are connected. So Haverhill, which is is growing, particularly with sort of lower value businesses, will grow, I think, with higher value businesses if there is a better route from Linton out to Haverhill. But it is dependent on those kinds of things.
Yes, okay.
And I just want to say one sentence, which is basically all these market towns will benefit from an efficient connection with the centre.
Yeah, and just so the other point we're getting is that the actual population, they're nice places to live, and from the point of view of being on these transport links, they will be very attractive for people who wish to move. There will be some people who want to live in a densified city, the urban living. I mean, so at the moment it's pretty unfashionable because of COVID, but the point, to go back to Ying's study of MERS and SARS, was that cities are not dead. You've got to sort the pandemic, but cities have a function. People like cities, but people also like living with their families, particularly with children, in kind of more rural areas. And towns or cities like Ely, and towns like Saffron Walden and Haverhill and Huntingdon and St Neots, they are going to be attractive sites for people to live in, and they will bring higher value earnings into those towns. If you take a town like Huntingdon has actually got a very curious income mix. It has some quite high value people who work in Cambridge, and then a lot of people who work kind of relatively low incomes. That will change. Higher value jobs will come into that town, and the spend in those towns will rise, and the shopping will improve, etc.
I think that's quite an optimistic note to end on as we look ahead to a post-COVID future. So thank you both very much. We're now just slightly past 2, so slightly past 5, sorry. So thank you very much to everyone who has attended. We hope that you found that interesting and informative, and has provided you with some thoughts to take back to your own area, whether that's Cambridge or beyond. So thank you once again to Matthew Bullock and Dr. Ying Jin, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.